Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into how the idea of otherness can really shape conflicts.
It's a fascinating topic.
And we're going to be looking at it through two pretty different lenses, actually. We're going to be using the conflict in Congo,
Right.
and also we're going to be looking at the movie The Fault in Our Stars.
Okay.
So, like, a global conflict and then a very personal, intimate story.
Yeah, it's interesting how those dynamics of, difference, and especially cultural difference, can play out in these different scales.
Yeah.
And, lead to misunderstanding or violence even.
Yeah. And hopefully, by the end of this deep dive, you can start to see it in your own life and understand it better.
Yeah. So let's maybe start by defining a couple of key terms. When we talk about ethnicity, we're not just talking about like a shared culture or tradition.
Right.
It's really about how people identify themselves and also how they're perceived by others.
Yeah, it's almost like this quote that we pulled from Jacques Derrida. He said that ethnicity is a fable, a fabulation, a fabrication, even a fib, a story.
Yeah. And so it can be a powerful story. And, you know, like any story, it can be interpreted and manipulated in different ways.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's go over to Congo. We have some research here that kind of lays out a pretty stark picture of the conflict there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a complicated story.
Uh-huh.
And long. I mean, we're talking centuries of colonialism.
Right.
You've got the legacy of the slave trade, ongoing cycles of violence. I mean, millions have died as a result.
Yeah. And the research even points out, like, the contrasting history with Rwanda, which is a smaller nation, right?
Right.
And more homogenous. But,
Yeah.
They have suffered from extreme violence, too, like in 1994.
Absolutely. And you have now these tensions between Congo and Rwanda that are fueled by these historical wounds and accusations of genocide and this deep mistrust. It's really tragic.
Yeah. One thing that really struck me was the irony that both Congo and Rwanda, they both have very significant Christian populations.
That's right.
They're considered reached,
Yeah.
but they remain so divided.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
It makes you think about faith and reconciliation in a place where, religion has been so intertwined with, power and conflict for so long.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's shift gears again to The Fault in Our Stars.
Okay.
I know, it might seem weird to bring up a teen romance movie when we're talking about war and genocide.
Right. But the research actually gets really interesting here. It uses this, seemingly lighthearted film
Yeah.
to really show how otherness operates on a personal level.
Okay, so remind us what happens in the movie.
So the movie centers on Hazel and Gus. These are two teenagers battling cancer. They fall in love.
Right.
And they become obsessed with this book. And its author, who's this really reclusive guy named Peter Van Houten, they actually travel to Amsterdam to meet him, hoping to get some answers about the book's ending. It's kind of ambiguous.
Right.
And
it doesn't really go as planned. Right.
it does not go as planned.
Yeah.
Van Houten turns out to be this kind of bitter, cynical guy who really just dismisses their questions and their emotional investment in his work, in his book.
He's like, it's just a story. Get over it.
Yeah, get a life.
Yeah.
And the research argues that this scene is crucial for understanding otherness, because Van Houten, kind of in his grief and disillusionment, embodies what some scholars call a crisis of modernity.
Yeah. Okay, break that down for us.
Okay, so think about it. He's obsessed with logic and reason, right?
Yeah.
And he can't really deal with Hazel and Gus's very real, very raw emotions because it just doesn't fit into his worldview.
Right.
It's too messy.
Yeah, and this is where, like, Michel Foucault comes in, right? The research mentions his work on the history of madness.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So Foucault argued that during the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Reason, people who didn't fit that mold of rationality,
Right.
they were labeled as mad, and they were often ostracized, locked away even.
Well,
they were seen as the other, something
Yeah.
to be feared, something to be controlled.
so is the research saying that Van Houten, in his inability to cope with, the messiness of life and death and emotions, represents this kind of othering?
Precisely.
Yeah.
He dismisses Hazel and Gus's need for meaning, for closure, because their way of experiencing the world is just different from his.
Yeah.
They represent more of a postmodern perspective. They embrace the ambiguity.
Right.
They find connection, even in the face of tragedy.
Right. Okay, so we've got this clash of worldviews happening in the film.
Yeah.
But how does this connect back to Congo?
Yeah.
I mean, we've gone from this personal conflict to like a massive complex war. How do these things relate?
Right. And that's the beauty of this deep dive, you
Yeah.
know. The research argues that these same dynamics we see in the film, right?
Yeah.
This dismissing someone because their perspective is different, that's also at play in Congo, you know. Think about those historical narratives. There's stereotypes,
Right.
the long-held grudges,
Yeah.
you know, that fuel the conflict.
It's like both sides have created this other, and it's made it impossible to see any shared humanity.
Absolutely. And that's where cultural intelligence comes in.
Okay, what is cultural intelligence?
Well, cultural intelligence is it's really the ability to recognize and understand different cultural perspectives,
Right.
to see how those differences shape people's values, their behaviors,
Yeah.
and then using that understanding to kind of navigate those differences effectively.
So it's not just about tolerating differences, but like actively learning about them.
Exactly.
And then using that knowledge to build bridges.
Right. And the research suggests that this is really crucial for breaking down those barriers of otherness.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's in a personal relationship or in a large-scale conflict.
Yeah, but isn't that easier said than done? We're talking about centuries of conflict, deeply ingrained prejudice. How do we overcome that?
I mean, it's definitely a challenge, uh, but the research does highlight some alternative perspectives on conflict resolution that I think offer a path forward.
Okay, like what?
Well, so scholars like John Hutchinson and Gunther Schley,
Uh-huh.
they argue that we need to move beyond these simplistic explanations that blame conflict just on cultural differences.
Right.
They point to the role of what they call societal shocks,
Okay.
things like wars, economic crises, even large-scale migration.
So like external events that really shake things up.
Exactly.
Right.
And those can make existing tensions even worse.
Yeah.
And, you know, they can reshape identities, they can reshape power dynamics, make groups feel more threatened,
Right.
you know, more likely to cling to their differences.
And then harder to find common ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Hutchinson and Schley, they argue that recognizing the shared humanity
Yeah.
and rationality of the other is still essential for building peace.
Yeah.
You know, it's about seeing beyond those labels, those stereotypes,
Yeah.
and acknowledging the complexity of, you know, individual experience.
Right. Okay, so this is all starting to make sense, but what about the role of the church in all this?
Yeah.
Especially considering like what we saw in Congo and Rwanda, you know.
That's a crucial question. And the research really makes a strong case for the church, particularly in Africa and the West, to take a leading role in promoting intercultural understanding
Right.
and challenging those harmful stereotypes.
I remember we have that quote. It's from David Livermore's book on cultural intelligence. He says that the artificial separation of words and deeds by Western mission movements may be one of the reasons missiologists labeled Rwanda a success story in the early 1990s.
Yeah. It's a sobering thought.
It is.
It suggests that just focusing solely on conversions
Right.
without really understanding and addressing the underlying cultural dynamics can have, you know, unintended consequences,
Correct.
even devastating consequences.
It's like focusing on the symptoms, not the root cause.
Exactly.
You might see some temporary improvement, but
But the problem's still there.
right?
And the research suggests that the church, with its emphasis on love and compassion
Right.
and understanding, is uniquely positioned to address those root causes.
Okay. So if the church is going to play this role, like where do we even begin? What does that look like?
Right. Well, one scholar, Harvey C. Kwayani, he argues that African churches in particular should strive to be truly multicultural,
Right.
you know, serving as bridges between different communities. He says they should not just preach tolerance,
Right.
but they should actively seek to understand and appreciate the richness of different cultures.
I mean, that sounds like a pretty radical shift.
It might be, but it's a powerful vision. I mean, imagine churches becoming places where people from different backgrounds can come together, not just to worship, but to learn from each other,
Right.
to share their stories,
Yeah.
and to build genuine relationships.
That sounds amazing. But how do we get from where we are now to that?
Well, it starts with small steps, you know. It starts with recognizing our own biases, our own limited perspectives, and being willing to learn from those who are different from us, you know, choosing empathy over judgment,
Go ahead.
curiosity over fear.
And recognizing that those differences, while real, don't have to define us or divide us. They can actually enrich our understanding of the world and ourselves.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of infinities from The Fault in Our Stars comes in.
Oh, yeah.
You remember how Hazel and Gus talk about, like, some infinities being bigger than others?
I love that.
It's a beautiful metaphor, I think, for human experience. We all have our own unique infinities,
Right.
our own perspectives and stories to share.
And when we open ourselves up to those other infinities, when we listen and try to understand,
Yeah.
we expand our own world,
Absolutely.
our own capacity for empathy and compassion.
And maybe we start to see those others not as enemies or threats,
Yeah.
but as fellow travelers on this journey called life.
Right.
People with their own hopes, fears, dreams, struggles.
Yeah.
And, despite their differences, they're ultimately more like us than we might realize.
Yeah. That's great. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how this idea of otherness plays out in like a really complex conflict like Congo. But what does all this mean for us in like our everyday lives?
That's a good question. Because, believe it or not, these dynamics are happening all around us.
Yeah.
Even in, the smallest interactions.
Okay, so we're not just talking about like wars and genocide here.
Right. Think
Yeah.
about it. Like,
Yeah.
in your own experiences, have you ever felt misunderstood or dismissed because of your, beliefs, your background,
Yeah.
or just the way you see the world?
Oh, yeah. Like that feeling of being on the outside looking in, like your voice doesn't even matter.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, have you ever struggled to connect with someone who seemed really different from you?
Uh-huh.
Maybe you made assumptions about them or, judgments without really trying to understand where they were coming from.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think we've all been there. It's so easy to fall into those traps, especially today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the research emphasizes that this otherness dynamic, it just shows up everywhere, in our families, our workplaces, our communities,
Wow.
even in, how we consume news, how we interact on social media.
So basically we can't escape it.
I think it's more about learning to recognize it,
Okay.
to be aware of those moments when we're slipping into judgment or making assumptions, based on limited information.
Okay, so awareness is the first step.
Yeah.
But what comes next? Like, how do we actually break free from these patterns?
Right. Well, the research suggests that, cultural intelligence is really key here.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, it's not just about understanding other cultures. It's also about understanding ourselves.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's about recognizing that we all have our own biases. We have our own cultural lenses that shape how we see the world. And sometimes, those lenses can distort our perceptions and lead to misunderstandings.
So it's like we're all wearing these invisible glasses
Yeah.
that filter what we see and how we interpret it.
That's a great analogy. And cultural intelligence is, it's about learning to take those glasses off,
Right.
or at least recognize that they're there, being open to seeing the world through multiple perspectives, even if those perspectives, challenge our own.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we actually develop this? Is it something we're just born with? Or can we learn it?
It's definitely something we can learn and develop.
Okay.
And the research highlights several key strategies for doing that.
Okay, lay them on us. What are some practical things that our listeners can do?
So one of the most powerful tools, according to the research, is storytelling.
Oh, interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that.
I know it sounds simple, but, stories have this incredible ability to break down barriers and build connections.
Yeah.
When we share our own stories authentically
Right.
and we listen to the stories of others with empathy and without judgment, something really kind of magical happens.
What do you mean?
We start to see each other, as human beings,
Right.
not just as labels or stereotypes.
Right.
We start to understand the experiences, the values, the beliefs that have shaped, the people around us.
Right.
And that understanding can lead to, greater empathy, greater compassion, even forgiveness.
I love that. It's like instead of seeing someone as the other, you start to see them as another me.
Exactly.
That's another person navigating this crazy world like we are.
Yeah. And, the research also suggests that cultural intelligence involves being willing to step outside of our comfort zones a little bit.
In what way?
By engaging with people who are different from us.
Yeah.
Not just on a superficial level, but in a way that allows for genuine dialogue and understanding.
Right. So not just being tolerant of other cultures,
Right.
but actively seeking out those interactions
Yeah.
and learning from them.
Exactly. And it might feel, a little uncomfortable at first.
Mm-hmm.
We might make mistakes. We might say the wrong thing.
Right.
We might offend someone unintentionally. But, that's all part of the learning process.
It's embracing the messiness.
Right. It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers,
Uh-huh.
and being open to being challenged and even changed by those encounters.
Yeah. I keep thinking about that quote from The Fault in Our Stars about, some infinities being bigger than others.
Yeah.
And it makes me think that when we close ourselves off to those who are different from us, when we cling to our own limited perspectives, our own infinities actually shrink. But when we open ourselves up to new experiences, new ideas, new relationships, our infinities expand.
Right. And isn't that what life is all about?
Yeah.
Growth, expansion, becoming more than what we were before.
Yeah. So maybe cultural intelligence isn't just some abstract concept. Maybe it's the key to unlocking a richer, fuller, more meaningful life.
Yeah.
One where we can see the beauty in our differences and embrace the shared humanity that connects us all.
Right. Which leads to the question, what does it look like in action?
Yeah, let's get down to brass tacks. What are some concrete steps?
Well, it starts with awareness, like we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Pay attention to your own thoughts, your feelings, your reactions, when you encounter people who are different from you.
Right.
Notice any judgments or assumptions that come up.
So, if I'm scrolling through social media and I see a post from someone who holds completely different political views,
Right.
should I pause and ask myself why I'm having that negative reaction?
And exactly. Ask yourself, what's triggering this reaction in me?
Right.
Is it based on facts, or is it just based on, my own preconceived notions?
Right.
Am I even willing to consider a different perspective?
Okay, so step one is to just be more aware of our own biases. What's next?
Well, challenge yourself to step outside of your comfort zone.
Okay.
Seek out opportunities to interact with people from different backgrounds, different cultures. It could be as simple as, striking up a conversation with a neighbor you've never spoken to before, or attending a cultural event, or volunteering your community.
And go into those interactions with a spirit of curiosity and humility.
Absolutely. Remember, you're not there to fix anyone or to prove them wrong. You're there to learn, to listen, and to expand your own understanding of the world.
And maybe make a new friend.
Right. That's a great outcome. And as you engage in those interactions, remember the power of storytelling.
Yeah.
Share your own experiences authentically, but also be a good listener. Ask questions.
Yeah.
Be curious about the other person's perspective. Try to see the world through their eyes.
This is starting to feel a lot less daunting now. It's instead of being overwhelmed by, fixing the world, we can just focus on these small actions.
Yeah.
That can actually make a real difference.
And that's where true change happens. Not in these grand gestures,
right,
but in, those one-on-one interactions, those moments of genuine connection that, can really ripple outward and create, a more compassionate world, more understanding world.
Okay, so we've talked about how to, kind of spot this whole otherness thing and some ways to combat it.
Right.
But I'm curious, what does it actually look like to overcome these, deeply ingrained ways of thinking?
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to talk about it, but it's another to actually, live it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How do we go from just being aware to actually changing our behavior?
Well, I think it starts with a willingness to be uncomfortable,
Yeah.
to admit that we don't have all the answers and to be open to being challenged.
That's kind of scary.
It can be, but it's also incredibly liberating. I mean, when we let go of the need to be right all the time,
Right.
when we embrace the idea that, we can actually learn and grow from those who are different from us,
Right.
it opens up, a whole new world of possibilities.
So be more humble.
I think so.
Yeah.
Recognizing that our own experiences and perspectives are limited, and that there's always more to learn, approaching those who are different from us with curiosity and respect rather than judgment or fear.
That makes sense. But what about when those differences feel really big?
Yeah.
What if we're dealing with someone who's beliefs or values just seem like completely opposed to our own.
That's where it gets really challenging, I think, but also where cultural intelligence is most important.
Yeah.
You know, remember, it's not about agreeing with everyone or pretending that those differences don't exist.
Right.
It's about, finding ways to connect on a human level, to see the other person as an individual, with their own unique story, their own set of experiences.
So instead of focusing on what divides us,
Yeah.
look for that common ground.
Exactly. Even if we disagree on, fundamental issues, there's usually something we can connect on.
Right.
Whether it's a shared love of music, a concern for our community, or just, simply the desire to be understood.
And those small points of connection can be like a starting point
Yeah.
for building a relationship.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all human beings, right?
Right.
Striving for the same, basic things.
Yeah.
Love, belonging, purpose, meaning.
Right.
And when we can see that shared humanity,
Yeah.
those differences start to feel less daunting.
This makes me think of that Nelson Mandela quote. He said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite."
That's a beautiful quote.
It's so true. We're not born with these like prejudices and biases, they're learned.
Right.
But if we can learn to hate, we can also learn to unlearn it. We can learn to love,
Right, yeah.
to embrace difference.
To see the beauty in our diversity.
Yeah. So it's not about erasing our differences or pretending they don't matter.
Right. It's about recognizing that those differences are part of what makes us human.
Yeah.
What makes life interesting,
Yeah.
It's about celebrating those differences while also acknowledging that shared humanity that binds us together.
It's like that saying, our differences are our strengths.
Exactly. When we embrace diversity,
Right.
when we open ourselves up to other perspectives, other experiences, we enrich our own lives, and we create, a more compassionate, more vibrant world for everyone.
Yeah, this has been so eye-opening. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on this whole idea of otherness.
Me too.
So as we're wrapping up, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
I think it's that, we all have the power to choose love over hate, understanding over fear,
Right.
connection over division. It might not be easy, but it's always worth it.
Beautifully said. And remember, it all starts with that simple question, what does this mean for me?
Yeah.
How can I apply this, this cultural intelligence in my own life,
Right?
in my own interactions with others?
Yeah, because the truth is, building a more just and compassionate world, it's not someone else's job.
Right.
It's up to each and every one of us.
And if we can all do our part, imagine the kind of world we could create.
Yeah.
A world where differences are celebrated, where empathy and understanding are just like the norm,
Yeah.
and where everyone feels a sense of belonging. That's a world worth striving for.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.